The Battle of Agincourt, 1415 AD, Henry V of England defeats the French. The Battle of Agincourt wasn't supposed to be an English victory. Outnumbered, outmanned, and knee-deep in French mud, King Henry V stood on the brink of disaster. But what if the greatest underdog story in history wasn't luck? What if this was all part of a bold, risky plan that turned mud, hunger, and longbows into one of the most legendary victories in medieval history? How did a bedraggled, exhausted army overcome a force nearly 5 times its size? Why did Henry risk everything, marching into enemy territory, only to find himself trapped? And what really happened on that cold, muddy night before the battle that forever changed the fate of England? Join us as we unravel the plots, battles, and moments of sheer madness that led to the Battle of Agincourt. From the grueling siege of Harfleur to the treacherous march to Calais and the tension-laden night before Agincourt, we'll dive deep into a day that echoes through history. And perhaps you'll find yourself asking, was it destiny, or was it sheer audacity that crowned Henry V the victor on that fateful day? On the damp, muddy morning of October 25, 1415, a weary, outnumbered English army stood ready for battle in a field near the village of Agincourt. The air was thick with tension. It was St. Crispin's Day, and for most of King Henry V's men, the day ahead seemed grim. On the other side, the French, confident, well-fed, and 5 times the size of the English army, were prepared to wipe out this bedraggled force. It seemed inevitable. The end of Henry's daring adventure in France. But history has a way of surprising us. How did we get here, to this muddy battlefield, with a young English king facing the mightiest army in Europe? The story begins with ambition, a mad French king, and a little something about a princess. Henry V had been King of England for only 2 years by the time of the Battle of Agincourt. Crowned in 1413, he was young, but he had a clear mission, to make England great again, before that was a thing. His claim to the French throne was the key to this greatness, or so he believed. But let's not kid ourselves. Henry's rise was anything but smooth. His father, Henry IV, had snatched the crown from Richard II back in 1399, and England had been a mess of rebellions and challenges ever since. People still whispered about whether the Lancastrian line had any true right to the throne. So Henry V knew that to solidify his rule at home, he needed something big, something bold. And what could be bolder than invading France? You see, Henry had his eye on France's crown. Back in 1360, the Treaty of Bretagne had ceded English control over large parts of France, Normandy, Maine, Anjou, and Aquitaine. But the French had conveniently forgotten about that. Henry wasn't going to let it slide. So, in the summer of 1415, he gave France an ultimatum. Henry's demands were outrageous, even by medieval standards. He wanted France to cede Normandy and the other territories back to England, pay a war indemnity of £1,600,000, and for good measure, hand over Princess Catherine of Valois as his bride, with a dowry of £2,000. Oh, and while they were at it, they should renounce any claim to the French throne, too. No big deal, right? Now, let's talk about Charles VI, the King of France. Poor Charles wasn't exactly in a position to negotiate. Known to history as Charles the Mad, he had bouts of insanity where he believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. At one point, he forgot he was the king entirely. The kingdom, meanwhile, was divided into rival factions, the Burgundians and the Armagnacs, who were too busy fighting each other to care about Henry's demands. When the French nobility, acting on behalf of their glassy king, refused Henry's demands, it wasn't just a diplomatic misstep, it was a declaration of war. In August 1415, Henry landed in France with about 12,000 men. His plan? Capture the strategic port town of Harfleur on the Normandy coast, giving him a secure base from which to launch his campaign. It sounded simple enough. But war, as always, had other ideas. Henry's army laid siege to Harfleur. The town's commander, Raoul de Gaucourt, wasn't about to surrender easily. As the English bombarded the town's walls and dug mines and tunnels beneath them, Raoul's men dug counter-tunnels, leading to some pretty intense underground clashes. Picture a medieval version of whack-a-mole, only with swords and sappers. The siege dragged on. Inside the town, the French defenders repaired their walls under the cover of night. Outside, disease broke out in Henry's camp, dysentery to be precise. The English began dropping like flies. The water was tainted, and Henry's men were weakened by illness. To make matters worse, Raoul's forces launched daring night raids, setting English siege engines on fire and disrupting Henry's plans. Finally, on September 22nd, after weeks of blood, sweat, and dysentery, Henry ordered a full-scale assault on Harfleur. The English surged forward, breaking through the breaches in the walls. Raoul de Gaucourt, realizing the fight was over, surrendered. Harfleur fell, but the cost was high. Henry had lost nearly a third of his army to combat and disease. Henry's original plan was to use Harfleur as a launching point for a campaign deep into France. But with his army decimated, that dream was over. Instead, he decided to make a risky march to Calais, an English-controlled port where he could rest and regroup. It was a gamble, and everyone knew it. Henry had only 6,000 men left, mostly longbowmen and infantry, while the French were gathering a force 5 times the size to intercept him. Henry's chief advisor suggested they cut their losses and return to England. But Henry Feth? He wasn't the kind of guy to slink home without a fight. God will defend the right, he declared, and the march continued. Join us as we journey back to the dawn of history. From epic battles to pivotal moments of triumph and tragedy, we're committed to uncovering the untold stories that have defined who we are today. Each video is meticulously crafted to transport you to the heart of the action, where you'll witness the struggles, triumphs, and sacrifices of those who came before us. But we need your support to continue our mission. By subscribing to our channel, you'll become part of a community dedicated to preserving and sharing our collective heritage. Together, we'll unlock the secrets of the past and ensure that they're never forgotten. Don't miss out on our latest releases. Hit the notification bell to stay updated on our newest videos, packed with thrilling narratives, stunning visuals, and thought-provoking insights. Subscribe, follow, and embark on an unforgettable journey through history. However, things quickly went sideways. Henry had sent Governor William Randolph ahead to secure the Somme River crossings, ensuring his army could make it to Calais. But when they arrived at the river, Randolph was nowhere to be found. Worse, the French had blocked the crossings, forcing Henry's army to march further inland, straight into enemy territory. For days, the English wandered the French countryside, dodging French patrols and trying to find a way across the river. Finally, after 11 days, they discovered an unguarded crossing and made it across. But their troubles were far from over. Word reached Henry that the French army, led by Constable Charles d'Albret, was closing in. They would meet near the village of Agincourt. On the night of October 24th, Henry's army camped in a muddy field near Agincourt. His men were exhausted, sick, and vastly outnumbered. The French army, with 20,000 knights, crossbowmen, and infantry, was poised to crush them. The French nobles were so confident of victory that they spent the night arguing over who would get the honor of capturing Henry and ransoming him back to England. They were already counting their profits. As they schemed, Henry's men prepared for what seemed like certain death. But Henry, ever the leader, gave a speech that would go down in history. "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers," he told them. It wasn't just a rallying cry. It was a bond. These were men who had marched, fought, and suffered together. And tomorrow, they would fight together against all odds. Dawn broke on October 25th, and the French knights, resplendent in their shining armor, lined up for what they believed would be a quick and easy victory. Constable Charles d'Albret and the French commanders ordered a full cavalry charge. The plan was simple: smash through the English lines with sheer brute force. But what they hadn't accounted for was the mud. The rain-soaked battlefield had turned into a quagmire, and as the heavily armored French knights charged, they found themselves bogged down in the muck. Horses stumbled and fell, and knights were trapped in the mud, their armor weighing them down. That's when Henry's longbowmen sprang into action. Thousands of arrows rained down on the French knights, piercing armor and flesh alike. The longbow, with its devastating range and power, was the great equalizer. French knights, once the terror of Europe, fell in droves. Despite the chaos, the French pressed on, but as they reached the English lines, they found themselves met by a wall of spears and swords. The English archers, once their arrows were spent, waded into the melee with axes, swords, and daggers. King Henry himself fought on the front lines, rallying his men and cutting down any French knight who got too close. The French army's superior numbers became their downfall. The battlefield was too narrow, the mud too thick, and the English too well positioned. French reinforcements only added to the congestion. Knights trampled over each other, unable to retreat or advance. The battle became a slaughter. As the day wore on, Henry's army stood victorious. Thousands of French knights lay dead in the mud, their shining armor useless in the face of English discipline and strategy. Among the fallen was Charles d'Albret, the French constable, along with countless French nobles. There was one desperate, last-ditch effort by a local French lord, Outnumbered d'Agincourt, who led a small band of knights in a futile attempt to turn the tide. But by then it was too late. The English had won a stunning victory against all odds. Outnumbered 5-1, they had triumphed through a combination of cunning, courage, and sheer willpower. Henry IV, covered in mud and blood, had led his men to one of the greatest victories in English history. In the aftermath of the battle, Henry faced a difficult decision. Thousands of French prisoners had been captured, including some of the most important nobles of France. Fearing a counterattack, Henry made a brutal choice. He ordered many of the prisoners executed. It was a cold calculation, but one that ensured his army's safety. The Battle of Agincourt became the stuff of legend. Henry returned to England a hero. His claim to the French throne strengthened. And for the French, Agincourt was a humiliating defeat, one that would haunt them for generations. But for the men who fought that day, it was something more. It was a story of courage, brotherhood, and survival against impossible odds. It was a victory born in the mud and blood of a battlefield, where kings fought alongside their men, and where history was made.